Chapter 1. Anele watched the white man sleep on the bench in the small park on the outskirts of Nyanga and wondered if the time was right for what he planned. He had noticed the white man several months back, but had only been watching him seriously for a week. He was still no closer to figuring out who the man was, or why he came to the park. That the man was white in itself was a novelty in Nyanga, one of the oldest black townships in Cape Town. It was established in the 1940s to house migrant labor who came to work in the farms. Anele had often heard his mother say generations of their family had lived in the township after moving from remote parts of South Africa. Genealogy and history didn't matter to 11-year-old Anele. All he knew was that the white man came early mornings to the park on foot. He carried a small duffel bag with him, which he placed on a bench, and then went into a routine of strange hand and leg moves for more than an hour. Karate, one of Anele's friends, had whispered once when the two had hid behind an empty oil barrel and watched the man. Bafana, Anele's friend, had a TV at home. He watched several programs, and if he said the man was practicing karate, then who was Anele to question him? People had initially commented about the man, but after a week, no one cared anymore. He lay in the park all day, lying on the bench or walking around, writing occasionally in a notebook. He ate fruits and sandwiches and drank from a bottle of water whenever he was hungry. He made no attempt to talk to anyone and ignored any attempts from anyone to converse. In any case, Anele wasn't there to be best friends with the white man. He was watching the white man for the right opportunity to rob him. Nyanga was the murder capital of South Africa. It witnessed several hundreds of killings and robberies each year. It had gangs of youths who stole from shacks and traded their goods for drugs. The gangs preyed on the weak and vulnerable and didn't hesitate to kill to get what they were after. Anele lived with his mom and younger sister in the Black City township of Nyanga, in a shack that had one main room that doubled as living room and bedroom, a smaller room which his mom occupied, and a tiny kitchen. Anele's home was similar to hundreds of other such shacks in Nyanga. A street away from his shack was a row of portalettes that the residents used, and on each street, laundry was hung out to dry. Nyanga, and in particular, Black City, was Anele's world. It was where he went to school. As schools went, it wasn't the greatest, but Anele liked it. It was the one place where he felt he could get away from everything. The squalor, his mother's unpredictable rages, her drunkenness, the gangs in Nyanga. School was where everything fell away. He liked numbers. He was the smartest in his class at math. He liked reading about faraway places, America, Australia, London, China, Beijing. Those names fascinated him. He dreamed of traveling one day, but knew it would never happen. He had never set foot outside of Nyanga and very likely would die there. Chances were high that he would die early, since there was a lot of pressure on him to join a gang. Bafana was in a gang. He went stealing with his friends from empty houses in Nyanga. He carried a knife. He boasted once that he had killed a man. Anele knew he should break off with Bafana, but his friend had saved him from a savage beating from another gang. Anele was beholden to him for that. Anele didn't know why he wasn't attracted to gangs. It was all too easy to slip into gang culture when young and follow most of his peers. They wore cool clothes and expensive shoes. Anele had none of those, and yet he wasn't tempted. Maybe it was something from his father's side, since his mother didn't really care what Anele did. Anele would have liked to find out if he had inherited that distaste of gangs from his father, but he never knew who his father was. His mother said his father had deserted them when he was very young. He had asked her once about it, but had been slapped. Azelle, Anele's sister, younger by 2 years, went to the same school as he, and it was because of her that Anele was thinking of stealing from the white man. Azelle, with her large eyes, braided hair, lush lips, and sparkly smile stood out in any crowd. She was very popular in school and always had a flock of girls around her. Boys were desperate to talk to her, and many of them approached Anele to get him to introduce them. Some of them did favors for him. Anele always kept a protective eye on his sister, for he was wise beyond his years. He knew all those who wished to befriend her didn't have good in their heart. He had noticed the black man a couple of months back hanging outside the schoolyard, occasionally talking to some students. The man had a battered Toyota that he parked outside the school and leaned against it. He used to dip into the window and hand something over to any student who approached him. It was only after a week's observation Anele realized the black man was a drug dealer. Anele thought about reporting him to the school or going to the cops. Then he realized where he was. Nyanga. Crime city, killing, drugs, prostitution. It all went down there. The black man probably had political connections or had bribed the authorities. Another week later, Anele found out he was worse than a drug dealer. Bafana and he had been walking back from school, one of the rare times Bafana attended school, and at the sight of the black man, Bafana had stiffened. He had grabbed Anele by the arm and had hurried him away from the man's sight. "You know him? Who is he?" Anele whispered. "Make sure Azel never talks to him," Bafana replied harshly. "Why? He steals girls. He sells them. He will want Azel." Bafana caught Anele's shirt and pulled his friend forward when his friend reeled in shock. Girls have disappeared whenever he is around. He comes from a larger gang in Cape Town. He mentioned a name that Anele recognized. Even we are scared of him. Bafana's gang had a right to be scared. He and his gang members were just kids. The black man's gang were hardened criminals. 2 weeks after Bafana's revelation, the black man made his move. One evening, Anele found Azel sobbing in their shack. Their mother lay in her bedroom, passed out, stinking of sweat and her client. Anele had done odd jobs in the neighborhood, like he usually did, and had brought home food. Azel had swiftly wiped her eyes, but not before her brother had noticed them. She confessed when his young eyes kept looking at her. The black man had accosted her that evening when she was walking back from school. He had promised her riches, a lifestyle she could only dream of if she went with him. For just an hour, he had come close and had brushed her body. No, he didn't do more than that, she quickly reassured him when she saw the rage in his eyes. Yes, she would tell him if the man talked to her again. Anele braced the man the next day while he was selling drugs to another student. He waited patiently while money changed hands, and the dealer handed tick, crystal meth, to the kid. The boy, the same age as Anele, ran away without meeting his fellow student's eyes. "How much you want, boy?" the black man asked Anele without looking up at him. Anele's rage broke to the surface. "Stay away from my sister. I know all about you." The man looked up without any surprise on his face, his red eyes sizing Anele. A deep laugh shook his body, and he casually slapped Anele with a large hand. Anele fell to the ground and scrambled back rapidly as the man stood over him. "Your sister's the beautiful one, hey? I know about you. I have been watching all of you. You know how much money she can make for me? I will have her. There's nothing you can do to stop me." He spat on Anele and drove away without a backward glance. Anele thought of murder that night. He thought of going to Bafana's gang for help. He considering going to the police. In the end, he decided to confront the man again. The man was in the same spot the next day, conducting his trade when Anele went to him. His eyes flickered briefly, and then he smiled widely. "Boy, have you brought her to me?" "I never will." The man nodded his head as if Anele had confirmed something. He caught Anele by the neck and dragged him to another car which was parked behind his Toyota. He opened its trunk and thrust Anele's face inside. Anele retched when he saw the mutilated body inside, that of a young girl. He tried to shake himself free and yell out. The man subdued him easily, a large hand cupping Anele's mouth. "I killed her this morning. She wasn't earning any more. I will bury her at night. I can kill you right now. How will you stop me? Your mother's a whore. She won't help you. The cops will not do anything." Anele mumbled behind the hand. "What you saying, boy?" He removed his hand. "I can give you money. Just leave her alone." Azel had news for him when he went home that night. The man had come to her again, she had told Anele. This time he had rubbed his hand on her chest. He had laughed when she had screamed. A few teachers had come out to her help, but by then he had vanished. The cops had been called, but they couldn't find him. Azel was scared. What was Anele going to do about it? Shouldn't they go to the cops? Anele didn't tell her that cops would be of no help. He had gone to the police station after his meeting with the black man. A bored police officer had taken his details and promised to investigate. As he was leaving, Anele had seen the police officer's reflection in the glass door. What he had seen had sickened him. The policeman had ripped up the report behind Anele's back and had tossed it in a bin. No, going to the cops again was pointless. Anele knew the man would be back. Maybe he would just kidnap Azel and disappear. He had been reckless in promising money, but it had just spilled out of his mouth. The black man had demanded 3,000 rand. 3,000! Where would Anele get that kind of money? And then he remembered the white man. And that's how Anele found himself in the park, watching the white man. Chapter 2. Anele had told his teacher that his mother wasn't feeling well, and there was no one else to look after her. She had bought the excuse and had given him the day off. Some boys had looked on enviously as he had walked out of the classroom, but Anele didn't notice them. His heart was beating so hard, and his palms were sweating so much that he thought for a moment he was having a heart attack. "Calm down," he told himself, and crouched deeper behind the barrel. The white man had a particular routine after coming to the park. He walked around doing his stretching exercises. He followed that up by running 10 laps in the park and then cooled down with his karate moves. A couple of hours of writing in his notebook followed. Lunch, a light nap, pacing in the park, and then disappearing between the shacks when evening fell. Anele hadn't figured out where he went in the evenings. Bafana and he had tried to follow the man a couple of times, but had always lost him in the narrow, congested lanes. Anele didn't plan to stay till evening. The man always placed his duffel on the bench as soon as he arrived. Anele planned to grab it and run when the man was in the middle of his karate moves. There were a few times when his back was to the bench, and one of those times would be Anele's moment. The duffel looked heavy, and Anele had spotted a fat wallet on a few occasions. There would be money in it, perhaps more than he needed. He would work out what he would do if there was more. For now, he had to grab the bag. He brought up Azel's face and the black man's words in his mind whenever he felt guilty. "This is Nyanga," he scolded himself. "Robbery takes place every day. Bafana has even killed another man. I'm just stealing." The man entered the park from the far end at 10 a.m. That was always when he came. Never late, never early. He walked languidly and ignored a few hellos tossed at him by a couple of older men. He never spoke. Maybe he was dumb. The bag was there. It went to the head of the bench as the man limbered up and started on his slow jog. Anele left the cover of his barrel and walked casually in the direction of the bench. He had his school bag with him and had a notebook out, riffling pages as he walked. A studious boy. He hoped he gave the impression of studying hard. He paused when he was 10 feet away from the bench and scratched his head. The man was still running. He had 3 more laps to go. Anele went closer to the bench, trying not to look in the white man's direction. He needn't have bothered, he felt, since the man didn't even look in his direction. He bent down to tie his shoelaces when the man slowed down and went to the center of the park to start cooling down. Anele tensed and got ready. The man started his first moves, about 25 feet away from Anele. Anele inched closer to the bench. The man turned away from Anele. Anele sprang forward, nearly stumbling in his haste. His left hand reached out and touched the duffel. Straps. Where were its straps? Anele's head swiveled between the man and the bag. There! His fingers slipped through the straps. It was heavy. That was his first impression. Something in it clinked dully against the bench. Anele felt cold terror sweep through him. He knew what that clink was. He had heard the same sound when Bafana's gun scraped against a wall. Gun! He's got a gun! Who is he? What have I got into? Anele was hyperventilating. Escape was the only thought in his mind. He ran as fast as he could, gasping loudly, straining his ears. He didn't hear any yell. He didn't hear any pounding footsteps. The exit to the park was just 10 feet away now. Once he got out, there were several alleys he could slip into and disappear. He was confident the man hadn't seen his face. He would remove the money, leave the duffel somewhere, and go to the black. Anele went flying in the air. He fell on the grass and rolled to his back, not quite grasping what had happened. A shadow fell across him. The white man. He had tripped Anele. How had he moved so fast? Anele tried to get up, sneaking a glance behind him. The exit was close. So close. Stay down. He lay still, not moving. The man spoke in Afrikaans in a local accent. He's local? For some reason, Anele had thought he was foreign. The man spoke again, this time in English. Do you understand me? Anele nodded his head dumbly, wondering how much trouble he was in. Would the man report him to the police? He didn't seem angry. His voice seemed normal. He reached out and took the duffel back and slung it across his shoulder. Anele felt despair set in. The bag was gone. He didn't have any money. The dealer would be back. He looked away from the man's piercing eyes, not wanting to show any emotion. You don't look like a thief, the man told him. I have seen you go to school every day. Why did you grab my bag? Anele swallowed and sat up. He rose slowly, half expecting the man to stop him. The man didn't. He stood and looked expectantly at Anele, waiting for his reply. It was the lack of anger that did it. 11-year-old Anele had spent the last couple of nights tossing and turning. He was scared that his sister would be kidnapped and would end up like their mother. At least their mother did whatever she did of her own free choice. Azelle would have no choice. She was so young. He burst into loud, gulping sobs, his body shuddering uncontrollably. The man didn't hold him, didn't speak. He stood there waiting for Anele to calm down. Anele took a full 5 minutes to calm down and blindly accepted the towel the man presented to him. He wiped his face and asked the man fearfully, "Will you be telling the police?" "Why did you steal the bag?" Still no anger in his voice. His dark eyes had a strange expression, compelling Anele to open up. He sat down suddenly, feeling weak, and words spilled out of him, no longer damned. "My sister will be kidnapped if I don't pay the black man 3,000 rand. He knew he wasn't making much sense, so he started again, slower this time. The man didn't move when he had finished. Anele glanced up at him. The man had a faraway look in his eyes. Anele fidgeted on the grass and caught his attention. "When do you have to give him the money?" Anele shrugged. They hadn't agreed on a time. "I was thinking of going as soon as I—" He dropped his eyes in shame. "Did he really touch your sister?" Anele looked up in anger. What kind of question was that? Why would Azelle lie? "Yes. Bafana told me he has a reputation. That man's gang kidnaps and sells young girls." "Can you show me this man?" Anele was astounded. Why? What are you going to do? It was the man's turn to shrug. I just want to see him. The police? What about them? You won't tell them? No. Anele felt relieved, but not by much. His problem still existed. I need 3,000 rand. I can't help you there. Show me the man. Anele nodded, trying to stem the darkness rising in him. What harm would it do to point out the black man? He took the white man back to school and stopped several car lengths away. He usually parks near that ground. He pointed to a small playground the school had. He looked down at his shadow. There's still time. He usually comes during the lunch break. They waited. The man withdrew a bottle of water and offered it to Anele after some time. Anele drank from it greedily, noticing too late that he had emptied it. The man didn't comment. He handed an orange to Anele and brought out one for himself. The two leaned against a truck, peeled their fruits, and ate silently. The white man didn't speak, even though Anele looked at him several times. He didn't even seem to move, but for eating the orange. He had this peculiar stillness about him that Anele found fascinating, but didn't dare ask. A bell sounded from within the school, and students rushed out as if experiencing freedom for the first time. Boys indulged in horseplay like boys did all over the world. Girls played their games, talked, brushed their hair, and some of them made eyes at the boys. Anele jerked his head at one of the girls. Azel, my sister, and searched the surroundings for the black man. He wasn't to be seen. The street was narrow and had a few cars parked in it. Teachers. They park here, he explained unnecessarily, hoping his companion would break his silence. They both saw the Toyota at the same time. It nosed into the street from the far end and crawled at a slow pace, as if looking for a vacant space. The black man was clearly visible through the windshield, his eyes flicking to his left and right. He eased into a space opposite the entrance to the playground and leaned against his vehicle and waited. His window was rolled down, and from its inside, music came blasting out. Anele and the white man were behind a black truck, and now that he thought about it, were perfectly concealed from the black man. The dealer's field of vision was to the front and to the sides. The two of them were behind his side angle. The first boy approached the dealer and said something to him. The black man laughed and dipped his hand inside his vehicle and came out with a plastic bag. The boy thrust something at him and ran away, clutching the bag tight. That boy's from another gang, Anele said tightly. They sell tick in the school. Teachers don't stop them. Why can't they call the police? He'll go before the police come. He's smarter than the teachers and the cops. Teachers are scared of him. Bafana said he raped one teacher. Anele hopped from one foot to the other, waiting for the white man to say or do something. The white man placed his hand on Anele's shoulder, making him stop fidgeting. More boys came, some of them much older, and later as the afternoon dragged on, a few older girls came to the dealer. The dealer started taking photographs after a while on a cheap camera. Of girls, Anele hissed. He saw Azel dart a glance in the dealer's direction, who waved a hand at her, insolently. That's why I need the money, he told the stranger who was watching the dealer. Like a hawk, Anele realized. Let's go, the stranger said after school had resumed. I have seen enough. What do you plan to do? What about my money? Anele kicked a pebble and watched it roll under a car. I told you I can't help you. Don't do anything stupid. Go to the cops. Tell your mother. Tell your teachers. None of them will help me, Anele yelled at his departing back. Azel will disappear one day. I know it. He got no reply. Chapter 3. His name is Kosi. Janda Swart nodded when the stranger described the black man to the SA Peace, South African Police Services officer. Swart was burly, dark-haired, and had piercing blue eyes through which he surveyed the world. The stranger was in Swartz's office in the Cape Town Central Police Station, which was just a few minutes' walk from the waterfront. The stranger was posing as a British journalist investigating Cape Town's gang culture and, in particular, crime in suburban townships such as Nyanga and Khayelitsha. His cover was watertight and his accent was excellent. Swart had served in the South African Special Forces and, after leaving his elite unit, had joined the SAPFs. He had spent years investigating gangs in Cape Town and had put away more than his fair share of gang bosses. He was widely regarded as the go-to man for gang info, both by the police as well as the media. He's a dealer for the Wicked Boys, an upcoming gang in the city. He's one of their enforcers too, a stone-cold killer, a rapist, an abductor. You name it, he does it. Where did you spot him? In Nyanga, outside the school. He was dealing and taking pictures of girls. The stranger didn't mention Anele or Azel, nor of the attempted robbery. Swartz's lips tightened as he typed into his computer rapidly. Sightings, he explained. We keep a list of who was spotted where, doing what. Basic stuff, but it has helped us arrest quite a few gangsters. He lifted a finger in the universal gesture of wait and spoke softly in his phone. I'll send a few SAP's vehicles, but I doubt they'll find him, he said when he had hung up. These gangs have a sixth sense. Sixth sense, the stranger repeated, with no inflection in his voice. Swartz's body tightened, and he searched his visitor's face for hints of sarcasm. Not finding any, his shoulders slumped for a fraction, and weariness showed in his eyes. They have their informers here. We have corrupt officers who are on the rolls of several gangs. It feels like a losing battle sometimes, but it's not one we can give up. The stranger left after Swart handed him a few pages on Kosi. Let me know if you see him again. I'll alert the school too, but I'm sure they know of his presence. The stranger lay in a small shack on the outskirts of Nyanga, on a hard bed, a thin blanket over his body to ward off the chill of the night. A woman's liquid laugh wafted in the air, and through the crack between the door and its jamb, he saw a young girl run in the street, followed by her mother. The woman scooped up her child, who shrieked in delight and kicked out with her tiny feet. For one moment, the stranger was transported to a different land, in the company of another woman and a child. He forced the memory away, turned on his side, and broke a promise he had made to himself. He had decided to be a spectator, a bystander, a watcher, when he had first arrived in South Africa many months back. Not anymore. He rented a silver Nissan the next day from a car dealer, a tired-looking car that looked like it would stall any moment. It won't, the dealer assured him. This baby looks like it will give up, but underneath the hood is a well-tuned engine. Zeb turned the key. The dealer was right. The throaty growl from underneath the hood was strong and indicated a well-maintained motor. He put down a deposit, drove out of the yard, and when he reached a secluded parking space, he replaced the plates with false ones. He drove to a building in Camps Bay, ran up 3 flights of stairs to his apartment, and went straight to the kitchen. He moved the refrigerator and from behind a painted panel that looked like it was part of the wall, extracted his go-bag. It had a couple of Glocks, several mags, NVGs, 3 knives, and various offensive and defensive pieces of gear that he had once used regularly. From another hiding hole, he removed a lightweight Kevlar jacket and slipped it on. His tee went over the Kevlar, and on top of it went a shoulder holster. Half an hour later, he was back in the Nissan, heading to Nyanga. 3 hours later, he was at the school, just as the lunch hour ended. Kosi was there, leaning nonchalantly against his Toyota, as if he had no care in the world. He probably doesn't. The stranger observed him from inside a Ford that he had broken into. The dealer wasn't who he was after, but he was the starting point. The stranger followed Kosi in his Nissan when the dealer had finished for the day, keeping a couple of car lengths behind the black man. Kosi made a stop before he left the neighborhood at a freestanding home near Settlers Way, which had a small yard in front of it. A couple of men lounged in the yard and greeted the dealer and escorted him inside. Kosi returned with a bulging bag that he tossed into the trunk. Daily takings? The house is a brothel? A female yelled at Kosi from an upstairs window, and a short conversation followed that the stranger couldn't overhear. The dealer gave a wave, gunned his vehicle, and left in a cloud of smoke. Definitely a brothel. The stranger followed Kosi as he drove to Philippi and approached a walled house with a gated entrance. A couple of uniformed men stood guard and opened the wrought iron gates to let Kosi in. The stranger didn't stop. He continued driving, just another resident returning home from work. He picked Swartz's dossier from the passenger seat once he was out of sight of the house and glanced at the lead page. Willem Goosen, leader of the Wicked Boys, lived in that house. It was late in the evening when Kosi emerged from Goosen's residence and headed to his shack in Khayelitsha. The shack bordered the Blue Downs neighborhood, and as shacks went, it was positively palatial. It had a yard, a driveway, and there was ample parking for several vehicles on the street outside. It looked like Goosen lived in a mansion while his men lived in shacks. It didn't seem that his men minded. Kosi whistled as he picked his backpack from the rear of the car and started walking to his shack. There weren't any pedestrians that time of the night, and even if there were, they knew better than to greet him. They all knew who Kosi was and gave him a wide berth. In fact, the shack's neighboring Kosis were empty, their owners having decided that the farther away they were from the dealer, the better. That suited Kosi better too. He liked his privacy. The women he brought could shout and scream all they wanted, and there would be no one around to hear them. No police came to his shack, not in recent times. Goosen had his snitches in the saps, and they always informed when a raid was due. Enough time for Kosi to clean up. Kosi was just a few feet away from his driveway when he first sensed human presence. He swiveled his head. "There, wasn't that shadow? A man? You want some tick, man?" he growled, making his voice guttural, knowing it scared most of the residents. "No," the reply came back in Afrikaans. "Then what do you want?" Kosi replied in the same language. The shadow came closer, and now the dealer could make out some details. The man was tall as him, but leaner. His face was shadowed by a cap, and Kosi struggled to make out his features. Something about the man, the way he kept on coming, alerted the dealer, and he grabbed at his back, pawing inside to get his gun out. He never knew what hit him. One moment, his gun was coming out. The next, his head was slammed against the side of the nearest vehicle. He thought he blacked out for a moment. The impact was so hard. The man stepped back when he slumped to the pavement, watching him breathe hoarsely. Kosi had killed men and women for pleasure. A stranger wasn't going to get the better of him. He roared and came off the pavement in a lunge, and took the man's knee flush on his face. His nose broke. His lips split. He swallowed a tooth and felt another gouge inside his cheek. The man crouched beside him and spoke to him conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather. "I'll kill you if I see you near the Nyanga school again." Kosi saw the man's hand blur, and then his head slammed on concrete and darkness descended. Goosen was perturbed the next day when Kosi didn't turn up to collect his stock of teak. The Wicked Boys worked to a plan and executed it in a particular geography. Each week, Goosen bought the drug from his supplier, got his people to sell it in Nyanga, Khayelitsha, and a few other neighborhoods, and paid the supplier at the end of the week. He got 7 days' credit from the supplier. That meant he had to sell his stock that week. Cash flow had to be maintained. Kosi not picking up his quota meant cash flow couldn't be maintained. That, in turn, would lead to perilous problems since the supplier was connected to a larger gang, which wasn't forgiving. He called Kosi's number for the 10th time. He wasn't picking up. "Eddie!" he shouted. "Eddie, where the hell are you?" Eddie, one of his hitters, came running with his gun out. "What? What's wrong? Are the Americans attacking us?" The Americans and Hardlivings were two of the largest gangs in Cape Town with whom Gooson's men had a running feud. "Put that away," Gooson sighed irritably. "Kosi's missing. Why don't you take another hitter and check out where he is? Maybe he's drunk." Eddie half-dragged Kosi to Gooson's living room later in the day, eased him into a chair and stood behind him, waiting for their leader's reaction. It came swiftly, predictably, and angrily. "Who did this?" Kosi mumbled something and peered through a swollen eye. "Who?" Eddie bent over his fellow hood to hear him and translated for Gooson. "He doesn't know. It was dark. Someone came from behind and attacked him." "He didn't fight back?" More mumbling from Kosi that only Eddie seemed to understand. "He did, but the man was too fast." "Did this man say anything?" "Keep away from Nyanga school. That's what he said." Gooson shot forward and roared in fury. "It must be those Americans. They want a war. They'll get one. He said he'll kill me." "And that scared you?" Gooson scoffed. "Eddie, you and Kosi will go back to the school, along with 2 other men. We can't show those hoods we are scared. We are the only supplier in that region. We can't give up territory." "Kosi," Eddie protested. "He'll be okay by tomorrow, ready to do war." Chapter 4. The stranger spotted the 6 hoods the next day as they drove through in Kosi's Toyota and parked in the dealer's usual spot across the playground. 6 men, because he had counted 6 heads. Kosi and 5 others. The black dealer got out of the car and stood straight, the bandages on his face contrasting starkly against his skin. The 5 others grouped around him and split after a brief conversation. 2 went to the mouth of the street and stood guard. 2 more went to the other end of the street and lounged against another vehicle. Kosi and the last man rolled down the car's windows and set up shop. None of them spotted the stranger. No one did, for the stranger was at the far end of the playground, behind a huge roll of electric cable. His combat fatigues were earth-colored and blended with the ground he was lying on. His binos had anti-reflective lenses, and unless the drug dealers entered the playground and approached him, he wouldn't be spotted. He wasn't surprised at their appearance, nor at the numbers. Gooson couldn't afford to let one man shut down his operations. A show of force was mandatory. The school's youth gangs had to be supplied. The stranger watched them as the school bell rang, and Kosi's usual customers rushed out to buy their quota of high. Azel came out, followed by Anele. Brother and sister looked at Kosi, uncertainly at each other, and at a gesture from her brother, Azel went inside the school building. Kosi made a loud, crude comment, setting his men off in gales of laughter. Anele stiffened, but didn't look in their direction, and went to join his friends. School resumed, but the dealers still hung around, their comments growing louder and vulgar as time passed. A few teachers poked their heads out and withdrew them quickly when Kosi stuck his middle finger at them. They'll call the police, who might send a few cruisers, but Gooson's informers will be one step ahead. The stranger figured the hoods would stick around for an hour, since it would take that long for the police to reach the school. He was right. 60 minutes later, the hoods got in the Toyota, and after one last curse by Kosi, wheeled out of the street. The SAP's cruiser rolled in just 15 minutes later, and several police officers flooded the school. Too late. The stranger lay motionless until the police left. He didn't move when school ended and the students trickled out. Not a muscle on his face flickered when Azel darted a nervous glance at the street. Her head straightened when she saw no Toyota, and the stranger saw her relax and smile. He went to Kosi's shack when it was pitch dark, when no other human but he walked the street. He had surveyed the terrain earlier in the day and knew where every bend in the road was, where every tree and rock were near the shack. Preparation wasn't half the battle, as the saying went, but it went a long way to winning. Kosi's shack was the same as the previous night. Well lit, loud music making a window rattle. He heard a couple of voices from inside and crouched behind an empty vehicle. No movement on the street, movement from within the house. One shadow crossing a lighted window, then another. 2 men for sure. He was crossing the street when the first spotlight hit him, and a man yelled from behind, "I've got him! I'm going to cap him!" The stranger dove out of the light, just as the night was ripped apart by automatic fire. He rolled desperately, knowing there was a ditch just to his side of the street. He fell in it and lay for a fraction of a second, getting his breath back. Footsteps pounded from within the shack, and its door burst open. "Where is he?" Kosi yelled. "In that ditch. I told you we should have covered it." The speaker let loose another burst, and more weapons opened in the stranger's direction. Loose soil and stone splinters flew in the air and rained on the stranger as he burrowed deep, looking left and right for an escape. There wasn't one. The ditch was just that, a ditch. Maybe at one point it had been a trench to store rainwater, but now it was nothing more than any feature of the land. It rose and became street level at either end. It wouldn't provide him cover for long. Kosi and his men would come charging any moment. It would be all too easy for 1 or 2 of them to pin him down, while another appeared from the side and riddled him with holes. No other option but to go for Plan B. Plan B was a flashbang. He moved in controlled haste, reaching into his backpack to withdraw a custom handset and goggles and don them. The last item he removed was a flashbang. He raised his hand and threw it in the direction of Kosi and his men. It clattered, and for a second the world fell silent as the hoods stared at the device. The stranger gripped his Glock, and when he heard Kosi scream, "Run!" he opened fire just as the stun grenade exploded and night turned into day. Quick, short bursts, magazine empty, spare Glock leaping across from left hand to right, another sweep, a snapped head up, 2 men down, Kosi limping along with a second man, both of them struggling, fast reload, both Glocks ready. The stranger rose cautiously and fired into the body mass of the fallen men. Kosi turned at the sound of the shots and raised his gun. He shrieked when the stranger shot his shoulder. The second shooter was faster to react. He aped the stranger's maneuver, diving away into the darkness, but the stranger was expecting that move. His Glock followed the gangster in an arc, firing a fraction ahead of the escaping man, and heard the distinctive sound of rounds penetrating flesh. The night fell silent again, but for low moaning from Kosi. "I told you I would kill you," the stranger spoke softly. "Sorry, man," Kosi begged. "It wasn't my idea." The stranger blew his head off and disappeared into the night before Kosi's body landed. Chapter 5. The stranger watched the school the next day from behind the wire roll. No one ever came in his direction, perhaps put off by the rusty coils and thorny bushes surrounding it. Goosen had 2 choices. He could either let go the loss of 4 hoods and put a brave face on, or he could take vengeance. Since the school was the only link to the attacks on his men, the stranger half expected the wicked boys to roll into its grounds and buildings and terrorize students and teachers. However, they didn't turn up. Someone else did. The SAPFs. Several cruisers flooded the street and armed police officers entered the premises. The stranger spotted Swart among them, who later came out with a stately-looking woman, the head teacher. Much gesticulating and pointing followed, after which Swart nodded reassuringly and deployed his men. A bunch of them spread out on the playground. More disappeared into the school, and there they remained the whole day. Anele and Azel came out during the break, the sister talking shyly with one of the police officers, while her brother looked around searchingly. Maybe he's heard of Kosi's death. Someone would have discovered the bodies, and there would be news coverage. The next day saw the same police officers in the school, and the stranger decided Goosen had taken the first approach. The loss of his men would have hurt. He would have felt humiliated. But better to carry on the gang's business than to engage with the SAPs in a war he would lose. The stranger was wrong. Goosen struck the third day. The stranger got the first inkling of it when he heard the sound of running feet as he was lying on the bench in the park. He twisted his head to see Anele coming full tilt at him, his mouth open, his eyes large, his face sweating, his shirt dirty. It was reddened on the shoulder. Was that blood? The stranger was on his feet in one smooth move, the duffel on his back, his body warning him of impending danger. "She's gone! They took her!" Anele screamed when he was a few feet away. "They killed my mother. I tried to stop them." The stranger was moving even before Anele had finished, running, not waiting for Anele to catch up. Later, much later, Anele would wonder how the man moved so fast, so fluidly. One moment he was on the bench, the next he was in full flow, like a panther. "When?" the stranger asked him just one word. "Just now. I came as soon as they escaped. They tried to kill me. They missed." Quiet. Anele quietened and followed, his smaller legs pumping as hard as they could, blindly trusting the stranger without knowing anything about him. The stranger went to his Nissan, parked on a street outside the park, and silently pointed to the rear. Anele climbed into the back, and even before he was seated, the stranger fishtailed the vehicle and headed to Settler's Way. "Not that way," Anele yelled, and then remembered the stranger's warning and lowered his voice. "They were going to Philippi. I heard them." The stranger swung back and brought up the neighborhood map in his mind. The abductors would be wanting to make a quick getaway. It was midday, when traffic was lightest. Still, they would want the least obstruction. He turned in the direction of Sheffield Road and beckoned at Anele. "How many men?" "3. Anele's voice cracked. "I saw them. They are in a black Ford. I followed them when I escaped. One of them said, 'Take this road.'" "Sheffield Road?" "Yes." Maybe 15-20 minutes for the abduction. Anele took maybe 5 minutes to get to the park. They would lose 10-12 minutes to get to their car and bundle a struggling girl in it. So a 13-minute lead, closer to 15. The stranger jammed his horn down and surged ahead, keeping an eye out for black cars, sectioning, partitioning the street into small areas. First, black vehicles going the same way as him. Then the number of heads inside. Anything more than 2 heads warranted a closer look. A motorcycle roared past him, its horn blaring in protest, its driver giving him the finger. The stranger ignored him. He tunneled his vision. Only vehicles in his channel needed attention. Anything else didn't matter. He overtook a slow-moving truck, a family car, men on bicycles, motorbikes. They all fell away as he kept on honking and drove faster than the average traffic. Black car. He looked and then looked again. Not a Ford. Just one driver. He rushed past and was aware of the bespectacled driver looking on in astonishment. More cars, white, silver, slid past. A school bus. Just ahead of the school bus was a faster-moving car. Not in his channel. Ignore. Don't ignore. It was black. Sunlight glinted off its rear, making it hard to read its make or see through the rear window. He nearly swiped the side of the bus as he cut in front. Black Ford. Two heads in the back. He slammed pedal to floor and got as close as possible. Is it them? He gestured at the vehicle. Anele poked his head between the front two seats and squinted for a long time. The Ford sped forward. The stranger followed suit, closing the gap. He flicked his lights on, and that got a man in the rear to look back. It's them? I can see Azelle too. She's struggling. Get down, on the floorboards, the stranger commanded. What? No. She's my sister. Get down. Anele got down. Don't look up. Don't rise, whatever happens. But don't talk. The stranger removed a black mask from his duffel when Anele kept quiet. He pulled it over his head with one hand, adjusted it, and gripped the Glock in his right, both hands on wheel, Glock between right palm and wheel. He waited for an opening. No opening came his way. This was Cape Town. Everyone drove hard and fast. He came to a decision swiftly and swung to the right, coming close to another car. It honked, and its driver swore at him from inside his vehicle. The stranger looked right back at him and raised his Glock. The car fell back rapidly. Straight stretch ahead, just the Ford to his left, at a half-car's length lead, the school bus behind them. He coaxed all the juice he could from the Nissan, and it cut forward, started creeping up on the Ford, gaining on it. Its rear door was level with his front passenger door. One hood looked at them. He did a double take when he spotted the stranger's black mask. He leaned forward and appeared to yell at the driver when the stranger turned the wheel hard and rammed into the Ford. Metal screeched and rubber burned. Horns and screaming came to them through the windows. The stranger wasn't paying attention to the outside world. He was intent, powering the Nissan into the Ford, whose driver was desperately trying to escape. There was no room, however. The Ford had careened to the left edge of the road from the impact. Beyond that was a narrow sidewalk from which pedestrians had scattered. A building's compound wall boundaried the sidewalk. The stranger kept the wheel firm, the car shuddering and shrieking beneath him as all the horses under it galloped at full stretch. His windshield had shattered, as had the passenger window to the left. Through the cracks, he could see the driver's door of the Ford had crumpled. So had its right passenger door. Its windows had broken too. The two cars plowed sideways, each one trying to find traction, one to escape, one to smash harder. The stranger heard screaming from the rear seat, but before he could turn his head, the school bus crashed into both vehicles, its momentum pushing the two cars several feet forward. The stranger rocked forward, and only his superb conditioning kept him from ramming his head on shattered glass. He whipped his head to his left. The Ford's occupants were dazed. Right. Cars and vehicles were drawing to a stop. Behind, Anele was in shock. He saw his opportunity. The Ford's occupants would be in shock too. They didn't have his training and experience. He kicked his door open. 2 steps to come to the front of the Nissan, 2 steps to come closer to the Ford. A face turned to him at the front, blurred from behind the broken window. His Glock spoke twice, and red splattered on the remaining glass. Moving fast, controlled breathing. A fast run around the front of the Ford, going to its left side. Its rear door sprung open, a hand appeared holding a gun. His Glock was quicker. 2 more shots and a body half fell out of the car. "Don't shoot!" a voice yelled from inside. "Please don't shoot!" "Let the girl out," the stranger replied. Calm, as if it was a day in the park. "Don't shoot! She's coming!" Movement from within the car. The stranger crouched, seeking cover behind the front passenger door. A small leg appeared, wearing a school shoe. Another leg. Azelle came out, her eyes blinking, events moving too fast for her. He caught her arm and dragged her behind him. The Glock rose again, and this time he fired continually till the mag was empty. The spare gun appeared in his hand, and it straightened as he peered carefully through the rear door. The third hood was sprawled across the back seat, his eyes unblinking at the stranger. The stranger pulled Anele swiftly to his Nissan and thrust her in the back. Approaching people fell back when they saw the gun in his hand. Several men challenged him, but none came near. He engaged the stick shift and backed up, hoping, praying, the car would respond, that it was still drivable. It was. With a groaning screech, the Nissan separated, its nose turning sideways, its butt digging deep into the bus. Another stick shift and a hard turn of the wheel, and the Nissan broke free from the Ford and the bus. He accelerated, coaxing everything he could from the car. It responded, juddering initially and then quickened. Its smooth pickup was gone. It yawed alarmingly. Wind whipped through all its broken openings. But it went in the general direction he wanted. Escape was foremost. A side street, a secluded street where he could dump the car. He visualized the neighborhood again. They were still on Sheffield Road, still heading to Philippi. He blared the horn, which also worked, and swung to the left on a small side street, heading to Veltevreden Valley. Cars came to a sudden halt as they gave way. Bikes swerved and drivers cursed. He drove deeper inside residential estates and past rows of houses and shacks. He kept an eye out for a line of cars, passed several, didn't see what he wanted. There, in that alley, a parking space between two cars, a stick shift to reverse the protesting car, and then he was in the alley. He parked quickly, not bothering with the niceties of leaving enough gaps for the other cars, and hauled the two children out. He held up a hand to stop Anele from speaking. There was the sound of traffic in the distance, sirens wailing. None of them seemed to be coming their way. There were a few passers-by who stared, and then he remembered he still had his mask on. He showed his gun, and they ran, shouting in fear. He ducked inside the car again, ripped open the glove box, and removed a piece of fabric. He wiped the wheel, and all the surfaces he remembered touching. From the boot, what remained of it, he removed a can of gasoline and sprayed it in the inside of the car. "Run," he told the brother and sister. "Run," he repeated, and pointed to the mouth of the street. They ran. He tossed a lighted match and followed them. Chapter 6. The stranger forced them to walk when they reached a cross street, as normally as they could. He removed his mask, thrust his gun in a pocket, his right hand on it, and hurried deeper in the residential area. He kept his head bent, looking down at the pavement, and urged the kids along. Past several side streets, peering through the sides of his eyes, looking out for a getaway vehicle. There were several cars on the road, but he was looking for one that wasn't armed with an alarm. Anele panted beside him, and his sister trotted a step behind. Both of them had numerous questions for him, none of which he answered. He found a Toyota, a compact, outside a shack, and after jimmying its window open, bent inside, hiding his body from the children. There were several ways to start old models of cars, and he knew all of them. There wasn't any need for Anele or Anele to learn that particular skill. They got inside the back without a word from him when the engine came to life satisfyingly, and he headed out. He drove as hard as he could to his apartment in Camps Bay, knowing time was imperative for what he had planned next. He drove fast, but not noticeably so, and reached his building in 45 minutes. He continued past it, keeping an eye out for police vehicles. There were none. He wasn't expecting them, since the apartment was rented in a false name, different from the identity he had used with Swart. He parked in a line of cars and motioned for the kids to stay inside while he switched plates with another car. He led them out and couldn't help smothering a smile at their astonishment. Anele had been kidnapped and had been heading to a life of rape and slavery. Anele had seen his mother killed. Despite that trauma, the kids looked around in wide-eyed wonder at the upscale neighborhood, at the neatly kept streets and the tall trees. The ocean could be heard crashing in the distance, and Anele tried to stand on her toes to look over the surrounding structures, possibly the first time they've been here. He gave them a moment, and then took them across the street and up to his apartment. "You will stay here till I come back," he told Anele, who hadn't lost his look of wonder. "There's food in the kitchen. The bathroom's down the hall. Don't use the phone. Don't answer it if it rings. Don't open the door if anyone knocks." He knelt down and looked the boy in the eye. "Do you understand?" Anele nodded. "Where are you going?" The stranger didn't answer. He moved the large couch in the living room and removed the false panel from behind it. His hand was reaching inside when Anele spoke for the first time. "They were going to sell me," she said in a soft voice. "One of them touched me." Her head turned away in embarrassment, and a tear slid down her cheek. "Where were they taking you?" the stranger asked, knowing his face had tightened and his insides had coiled. She sniffed and wiped her face. "Somewhere in Philippi. Goose." They said something like that. Goosen. The stranger had figured that out, but it was still good to get confirmation. Her next words chilled him. They said there were 2 more girls in the house. He turned back to the opening behind the couch and removed several long, tube-like structures, about 6 pounds in weight each and half a meter in length. They were dull brown and clanked when he placed them on the floor. The kids forgot their misery, their circumstances, momentarily, and stepped forward. They halted when he raised his head and looked at them. He withdrew several tapered shapes and placed them next to the tubes. Next came out a couple of heavy chains and padlocks, a HK MP5 with several spare mags, a combat suit that the Reckies, the South African Special Forces Brigade, favored, and lastly 2 sat phones. He went to an inner room, changed into the combat suit, and returned to the living room. The tube-like weapons went into a kit bag along with most of the equipment. The MP5 over his right shoulder for easy reach, spare mags into various pockets, a combat knife into a sheath on his thigh. He beckoned Anele when he had finished gearing up and handed him the sat phone. "Call me on this, only on this, if you have any problem." He showed the boy how to use it and headed to the door. "Who are you?" Anele asked him once. He didn't reply. He didn't want to give Goosen time to regroup. He wanted to attack hard while the wicked boy's leader was still coming to grips with another loss. The stranger was sure that Goosen would have heard of a black-masked man assaulting his people. He was sure Goosen would surround himself with as many people as he could. He was confident Goosen would be ready for an assault. The stranger intended to give what the gang boss was expecting, with a difference. He would use overwhelming force and speed. An old lady looked at him when he stepped out of the apartment building. "It's okay, Mom," he told her in English with a local accent. "I'm with the Reckies." He called Swart when he was driving, heading to Philippi. Swart's number rang thrice before he picked up. "Hello?" He sounded harried, breathless. "Do you recognize me?" the stranger asked him without identifying himself. Swart paused. "The journalist?" he asked hesitantly. "Yes. Do you remember Operation Tango?" "How do you know that?" Swart turned sharp and authoritative. Operation Tango was a deep black operation carried out with American and South African Special Forces teams to foil an attack on the South African president. "I was the sniper," the stranger told him. "You were the commander of your Reckies team. You never saw me." He gave some more details about the operation to confirm his identity. Only someone who had been in on it as a sniper would know those details. "What's your name? What do you want?" "I want you to stay away from Philippi for 2 hours." "Why?" "I'm cleaning up some trash." The The stranger parked his car a couple of streets away and approached Gooson's residence on foot, his bag over another shoulder. An armed forces officer, fully kitted out, walking the streets of Cape Town was strange, but not unusual. He got a few passing glances, but no one pointed fingers. No one yelled out. No one got onto their phones and made hurried calls. There was reinforced security at Gooson's gate. 4 men instead of 2. 2 of them were clearly hoods, tats on their face, assault rifles carelessly slung over their shoulders. The stranger walked to them, not hurrying, aware of their eyes turning on him. Boring holes. "Army pig," one hood muttered when he was within earshot. The other hood laughed, his humor turning to startled alarm when the stranger shot the first one without breaking a step. The Glock spoke again, and the second hood crumpled. The 2 guards reacted faster. One of them sprang away, his rifle rising. He went down with a round in his forehead before he could fire. The last man clutched at his rifle, thought better, and turned to flee. He too fell when a 4th round found him. The stranger holstered his gun, put on his mask, gloves, and then turned to the security cameras mounted on 2 pillars on either side of the gate. He shot them, pulled the swinging gates closer together, and padlocked them with one of the chains. He ran along the compound wall to the rear of the house and shot the 2 lounging hoods at the back. The cameras were similarly dealt with, and the rear exit padlocked. He went to the front of the house where a crowd had already started gathering. They scrambled back when they saw him approaching, and when he raised his gun in the air, they scattered. "Keep away from the house," he ordered them, once in English, then in Afrikaans. He stepped onto the street and stood in the center and raised his gun in the air. Brakes squealed and vehicles swerved. "Keep back! Keep well back!" he shouted. Traffic backed up and started reversing. A head poked out of the car. "What's the problem?" "Terrorists," he replied. That was sufficient answer for traffic to drift away, seek alternate routes. He crossed the street, placed his bag down, and removed one tube from it. It was a M72A7, a portable rocket launcher with an armor-piercing round. He wasn't dealing with a tank. He was using it against a brick-walled house with a lot of glass fronting. He aimed at an upper floor which had a wide glass door. Probably looks out on a swimming pool. The girls will be on the ground floor. More men to surround them. He took aim as the first sounds of shouting and yelling came from within the house. The rocket left in a flat crack, and in the next instant, the patio door shattered. He picked up another tube quickly, hoping the compound wall wasn't stone. He aimed next to the gate, and the wall cracked. He fired another launcher, and another rocket widened the crack. A third rocket collapsed the compound wall amidst clouds of dirt and dust. The yelling had become louder from inside. An automatic rifle raked the street, coming in his direction. He took off at a sprint, initially heading for the breach, his left hand removing several smoke grenades and tossing them inside the compound. He changed direction and ran to the rear of the house, and using the wall as support, vaulted lightly over it. First impressions. He was behind the house, a large window facing him. Sounds were louder, a female voice was screaming. There was the sound of running feet, and from around the wall, a hood came running. He went down quickly when the MP5 chattered. The stranger flung more smoke grenades through the window, and instead of entering the house, sidled around the wall. It curved to the front. A shadow appeared, and he dropped just in time as automatic fire came his way, chest high. One burst took out one hostile, another took out a second. 9 down. He figured there would be 5 or 6 more inside. The Wicked Boys had 15 hardcore shooters, according to Swart. Goosen would surround himself with all of them, with the dealers and pushers remaining on the street. The 2 guards at the front? They weren't shooters. 7 shooters down. 8 left. Goosen makes 9. The 2 girls. Maybe a buyer inside? He was counting on surprise and shock, and the expectation that the attacking force was more than one person. He couldn't allow Goosen to think. Should have brought the launcher along. He had left it on the street. Have to use flashbangs. He went back to the rear window and peered swiftly. It was the kitchen. It was empty, dense smoke filling it. His mask filtered out the smoke, the mufflers on his ears, muted sound. Through the kitchen, to a hallway, a dining room where shouting was louder. He snapped a glance. 3 men arguing, breaking off when they spotted him. He ducked out and threw a flashbang, dropped to the floor when it exploded, and from around the door jamb, raked the room blindly. The hoods were down, out of action. The living room was empty. A side door was open. Enter or not? A smoke grenade did the trick. From inside the room, probably a study, a bare-chested man stumbled out, rubbing his eyes. He was pot-bellied, his chest wobbling. A buyer? I came for the girl, he whined piteously. The stranger shot him and then fell forward when a round struck him in the back. It was a heavy round and felt like a mule kick. Move. He kicked out desperately and threw himself away, turning, swinging the MP5, triggering without conscious thought. The sound, a continuous roar, a chandelier falling, breaking into a million pieces, a groan, a scream from somewhere across, and then he was against a wall, replacing the mag in blurring speed, firing till 2 bodies tumbled down a staircase and fell still. 3 hostiles left, plus Goosen, living room empty, study empty, dining room empty, kitchen clear, store clear, no girls on the ground floor. He was wrong on that count. That left the upper floor. I've got the girls, a voice came from upstairs. I'll kill them. The stairs were concrete, no wooden floorboards to creak, wrought iron railing, on top of which a wooden banister ran. Expensive. Drug dealing and trafficking is a profitable business. I'll kill them, the voice shouted again. There were muted whispers and a harsh get him. The stranger clung to the sides of the steps and used his hands to haul himself up, step by step. From the top, a small part of his head would be visible. His Glock was between his teeth. Not ideal, but it was the best he could do. The men sent to get him burst onto the landing, spraying and probably praying. 2 men ducked to the landing while 1 man stayed upright. Even if the standing man went down, the 2 prone men would get the attackers. Decent tactics that would probably work on street hoods, most of whom hadn't experienced what hostile fights were. They kept on firing long after their eyes told them there was no attacker coming up the stairs. Enough time for the stranger to free his right arm, take aim with his Glock, and put them down. You got him? Goosen inquired cautiously. I'll kill them, he screamed when his men didn't reply. Don't, the stranger replied after getting to the landing. It went to 2 large rooms, one of which was damaged by his rocket. It was empty. Throw your guns down, Goosen yelled from the second room. The stranger threw his Glock into Goosen's room. All of them. Goosen's voice was cracking in fear and rage. The stranger tossed his MP5, 3 flashbangs, his spare Glock, and stepped closer to the door. He couldn't see Goosen, but imagined he was in the center of the room, the 2 girls in front of him. Come forward, slowly, hands up. The stranger stepped into the room. His assumption was right. The gang boss, ordinary features, close-cropped hair, a light beard, was at the foot of a bed, holding a handgun to 2 girls. Azel's age, dark-skinned, scared, trembling visibly. Ask your men to give up. Don't shout. I can hear you. Goosen swallowed, the wild light in his eyes dimming for a fraction. Ask them to give up? He rasped. I can't. There's one right behind you, dangling from a rope, looking right at you. Goosen nearly turned. Tell him. Tell all of them. Sweat beaded his brow, and his finger tightened on the trigger. The stranger shook his head. He can't hear me. He's got these on. He pointed to his mufflers, kneeled to the floor, and started lying down. What are you doing? He's going to shoot you. It's a heavy bullet and might go through you. I want to get out of the way. Goosen's eyes flared wide, and he swung back and collapsed when the stranger's knife buried deep in his neck. Chapter 7. The stranger took the girls through the rear exit and used a convoluted route to get to his parked car. He had left most of his weapons behind, but for his MP5 and his Glocks. Those left behind didn't have any identification marks. The girls ran beside him, obeying him blindly, their brains going into a passive state. Shock and an adrenaline overload did that. He drove back, taking random streets, backtracking several times to throw off any pursuers. He turned on the car radio once and heard news bulletins, one eye on his mirrors. All stations reported the assault on Philippi. The police had no comments to make. They were investigating. They didn't have anything to say on the Sheffield Road incident either. Was that you? Swart answered when the stranger rang him. No, it was you. A long silence while the SAPS man processed what the stranger meant. I can't take. You can. It was an elite operation. No innocent lives were lost. A ruthless gang was put down. You'll get a promotion. Your men will get medals. It's not how we do things here. Do it now. Why are you doing this? I have 3 girls and a boy with me. The girls were to be sold. The boy's mother was killed. I need to meet you. Alone. They met in a park not far from the Camps Bay apartment building when it had gone dark under a street lamp. The stranger remained in the shadow when the SAPS officer approached. Swart lit a cigarette and blew a plume of smoke in the air. It happened just like you said it would. The media asked me questions. Ministers called me and congratulated me, promised me a promotion, a bonus on top. No civilians injured? No. Swart strained his eyes to look at the dark shadow in front of him. We found several rocket launchers. We claimed them. Several people came forward and said a Recce's man had fired them. We said it was a joint operation. You said there were 4 children, he asked when the stranger remained silent. Where are they? There was a killing in Nyanga in the morning. It's all connected. The stranger gave him an abridged version of all the events without going into too much detail. Swart had burned through 2 cigarettes by the time he had finished. Where are the children? He asked when he had digested what he had heard. Are there good foster homes for Anele and Azelle? Maybe for the 2 girls as well. I don't know their backgrounds. There are several, Swart replied cautiously. All of them are expensive. Are they good? Swart nodded. I know 2 in particular. They have a very good record. Swart kept glancing sideways at the stranger as the SAPS officer drove them to the apartment building in Camps Bay. That shot! It was an unbelievable one. The stranger knew what he was referring to. It was his kill shot that had taken down the gunman who was lining up on the president. It's just practice and a little luck. Swart made no comment. It was more than that, but he held his words. He parked at the stranger's directions and followed him inside the building and stood for a second inside the well-appointed apartment. 2 girls were asleep on a couch. On another couch were a boy and a girl, Anele and Azelle. Azelle was dozing and jerked when the stranger and Swart entered. This is Jan de Swart, a SAPS officer, the stranger introduced the police officer. He has something to tell you. He leaned against a wall and watched while Swart spoke softly to the 4 children. The 2 girls had families in Khayelitsha. They would be reunited with them. Anele and Azel would go to a foster home, which in turn would place them in foster families. They won't separate you. They will put you with a good family. It will be a new start for you, away from the gangs of Nyanga. Swart's voice was kind and reflected his experience in dealing with such situations. Anele and Azel had questions, several of them, that he answered. Anele turned mutely towards the stranger when Swart had finished. The stranger crouched beside Swart and looked the 2 children in the eye. "Your friend Bafana. He will die soon. No one in a gang grows old. You know that. Is that the life you want?" Anele shook his head. "Our mother? She will be buried properly. Swart will take of it. He will arrange the disposal of your shack." "I was in a foster home myself," he told the brother and sister when they looked uncertain, and Azel's eyes started filling. "It will be better than the life you had." "You grew up like that?" Anele asked, trying to put on a brave face. "Yes. Do you want to go back to Nyanga?" Both of them shook their heads. Fast. "Swart will make sure you have a better life," he said, looking sideways at the SAPS officer. It was more than a statement. It was a warning, one that Swart acknowledged with a smile. "Our friend here isn't the only one who was a foster child." Swart's smile widened when he saw dawning comprehension on Anele's face. "That's right. I was one too. You will go to the same home I went to. I turned out normal, wouldn't you say?" Azel's smile was like the rising of the sun. The stranger took Swart to a bedroom when the 4 children were fast asleep. He opened a hidden safe inside a dresser and took out stacks of notes. "These will pay for the home, their education, anything they need." Swart hefted a bundle of 200 rand notes and estimated there were thousands of them in the stack. There were several such bundles. They would be more than sufficient for the brother and sister. He showed the officer his caches of arms. "Take them. They are untraceable. You can say they're the gangs. I have worked with several American Special Forces operatives. None of them speak Africans like you. None of them speak English like Cape Town natives." Swart couldn't hide his curiosity and watched as the stranger removed a bunch of passports and slipped them in his duffel. He changed into jeans and a tee and slid into a jacket. He handed his last weapons to Swart the Glocks. "They too are untraceable. Do you want to wake them?" Swart pointed at the 4 children sleeping on a large bed as he accompanied the stranger to the door. "No, it's better this way. It will seem like a dream when they wake up. The memory will fade away over time. You will keep an eye on them?" "Yes." He gripped the stranger's hand tight and asked the question that had been uppermost in his mind. "Who are you?" The stranger smiled, and Swart was struck by how young he looked. "Zeb Carter," he replied, and closed the door behind him. Zeb drove the car to Cape Town International Airport and left the stolen car in a parking lot. He headed to an airline counter and thrust a passport at the agent. "Where to, sir?" "New York." Zeb Carter was heading home. The end.